Welcome today to the final Get Savvy, Grow Your Green Stuff webinar of the calendar year. We'll be continuing this webinar series in January, but this is the last one for 2021. And we're going to be talking about planning for the unforeseen. So thank you for joining us today. Again, we are recording this. So if you happen to drop off or have issues hearing me or need to go somewhere, that's okay. We'll send you a recording in probably a few days or next week if we need to. So my name is Andrea Pellegrini and I run the Student Money Management Center for the University of Illinois System. So I serve primarily students, but also employees and parents of students for Urbana, Chicago, and Springfield campuses. And I'm joined today by Kathy Sweedler. Kathy, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here today when we wrap up 2021. So we've got kind of a deep topic today, but I think it's a great one to have a conversation about, and I'm really looking forward to being a part of today's presentation.
And I'm very thankful that you're able to join us today, since Nikki was unable to join us even though she was going to co-host today. So thank you to Nikki, who helped with some of the content, and for Kathy for jumping in today and also helping with the content. I definitely appreciate that. All right, so collectively, the Get Savvy team represents organizations across the state of Illinois, which is where all of our organizations rest on the land of multiple Native nations. We would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that all of these organizers for the webinar series primarily reside in Illinois and serve the state of Illinois, which includes ancestral lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. We have a responsibility to acknowledge these Native nations and to work with them as we move forward as a vibrant and inclusive society. So because, like I said earlier, we like to use that chat a lot, we want you to get comfortable with using the chat. Again, if you can't find it, usually it's in either the black bar at the top or bottom of your screen. Click on the chat box, open it up. Let us know in what state and or county you are logging in from today. We have people from Urbana, Illinois, Oklahoma, Iowa, Peoria, Chicago, all kind upstate New York, all over the country. Well, we appreciate you for joining us. Oh man, Washington County, New York, Illinois, Madison. Whew. Sangamon County, that's lovely. All right, in the interest of time, we're going to continue. So we're going to be talking kind of on a difficult topic today. And I just want to kind of acknowledge that we are not lawyers, we're educators. So if you have a tricky situation or things can be interpreted differently depending on where you are, it's good to contact a lawyer if you do have any questions about some of the topics we're going to be talking about, but we mainly want to give you the tools and terminology to be able to have conversations and plan for your families in the case something happens, right? So some of our learning objectives include identifying unforeseen situations to plan for, defining estate planning and related terms. We also want to kind of talk about some of the tools and considerations for planning for unforeseen circumstances, and then describe how to start estate planning conversations with loved ones, since that is a very important part of the planning process and very few of us are comfortable having those conversations. So again, we love to use that chat. So what are some of the things that are unforeseen that you can think of? And how might we plan for those? This is a difficult topic, right? Because they're unforeseen. How do we know what's going to happen? Car accidents, illness, yeah, death or disability, yeah, loss of job, terminal illness. Like these are things that we know can happen. or do happen. So I think these are good things to talk about. Long-term illness, storm, divorce. Oh, you're hitting all the really hard parts. And what are some of the things that we can do to plan for those? Even though they're unforeseen, we do kind of recognize that they exist, kind of what some of the obstacles might be, so we can kind of have contingency plans. And that's okay. We're here to talk about that today. POA, or power of attorney, insurance. It's a great way to protect against risk of loss. Starting the conversation. Thank you, Kamala. That's why we're here today, right? So you guys all kind of hit the main points that we wanted to talk about. So there are tons of unforeseen situations that you may be able to plan for. You're not going to be able to plan for all of them, but you may be able to plan for quite a few of them. So we're going to be focusing on how to plan for some of the most extreme unforeseen situations, like you said, death, incapacitation, maybe unconsciousness, might be related to like illness or car accidents. And some of these things may apply if you are even visiting or living outside of the country for a long period of time. So those are things to kind of think about when we're thinking about unforeseen situations. And we're using the legal definition of incapacitation. And for those of you that don't know, an incapacitated person may not be able to make or communicate responsible personal decisions. They exhibit an inability to meet their own personal needs for medical care, nutrition, clothing, shelter, or safety. If a person cannot make decisions on any of the issues, a general guardian may be appointed by a court. If the person has disability only in limited areas, then a limited guardian may be sufficient. A minor does not come under the definition of an incapacitated person under the law. So that's just something to consider. So we're going to move forward, and I'm going to let Kathy talk a little bit about defining the role of estate planning.
Thank you, Andrea. I think you've set a nice tone and pace for us here for today's presentation. And I just want to remind people that you can use the chat to ask questions as we go. It doesn't have to be just at the end. Sometimes it's nice to get that idea down before you forget it, or we can maybe clarify it even as we go. So go ahead and don't hesitate to put the questions out there. And so estate planning is something that I want to just say too, before we really get into it, that it's something for everybody. From my point of view, at least, and from many people's point of views, it's may sound like for something that just that rich old people need to take into consideration, but that's not really true, because it's really about thinking about what do you want to communicate to people that you care about, that are significant in your life. If something happened to you where you couldn't talk, or if you passed away or died. And so there are certain tasks that and legal documents that are available out there to help with that conversation that you want to have before the situation happens. And, so it's really is, I think, very helpful in that way to be thinking about it. It's not just when you get old, and it's not just if you have a lot of assets, but really there's a piece of it at least that everybody that's an adult could take into consideration. So let's put this into context of overall financial planning, because it is a piece of the financial planning picture. And we've really talked about this in many of our Get Savvy webinars. We often talk about goal setting and what do we want to do and for why. We've done a little bit about retirement planning and thinking about how to make the most of your job benefits to help you with retirement. Risk management, which is another piece of this whole financial planning puzzle, is really about talking about how do you manage those risks with your insurance, or are you going to self-insure, making those decisions. Investments, really a growing interest in this topic, I feel like, and we're going to be doing that webinar in January, but more to come on that soon. Tax planning, again, this has more importance for some people than others, but certainly learning how to get it all organized and getting it put together is a piece of our financial planning piece. And then the piece that we often just, I don't know if people get tired or they run out of energy, or it's really not the fun part of financial planning, estate planning, where we're looking at, what do we want to do with our assets if something happens to us? And also power of attorney, which really goes into health planning as well. So why bother with this? Wouldn't it be just a lot more fun to talk about how we can make a lot of money and be rich and be able to travel around the world? I think, given the choice, most people would prefer a different financial topic. But the truth of the matter is 100% of us will die, and we don't know when. And yet, really, less than half of people out there have a will. Only a little over a half have communicated what they want for the end of their life wishes to somebody that can help with that, even though almost everybody says it's important to talk about this, but it's hard, right? I mean, I get it. I find it hard, and I teach about it. So it's always easier to teach about it than to actually have that conversation with your mother-in-law or something like that. So I relate, but I'm so glad you're all on here today to talk about this. So maybe we can increase those percentages a little bit. Each person does matter. And, why, the other big why here is people, and the research backs this up, people do not make the best choices when they are stressed. And when somebody that you care about has been in an accident or is dying or is in some way not doing well, you're going to be stressed, and having to make decisions at that time without really knowing what that person's wishes are or how they'd want it to handle just increases all of our stress and makes the whole process as a family or as good friends together really difficult. And so the more we can have these kinds of conversations when there isn't that stress on us, the better, I think, honestly, that it will be for everybody. So the why is important. So what happens when you don't have these kinds of documents or conversations ahead of time? Well, the simple answer is, things will get decided and you just have no input. So if you don't want, that's really what happens. So without a will, there are legal procedures about what happens to personal property and assets. In Illinois, it's pretty straightforward. The spouse gets half. Any children get to split the remaining half. Then they start looking for other surviving relatives. And if they can't find anybody, then it may go to the state. Again, I am not a lawyer, so this is just sort of a general outline. There may be some exceptions to all of this. And it's always better to consult with a lawyer on something like that. But the main point, though, is you've given up any say in it. And it's going to be decided by the court, and that might work out the way you wanted, or it might not be what you thought it was going to be. And it may not work out the best for you or for others that are have to deal with it after you're gone. So does that motivate y'all? I hope so. So I've been through this a few times in my own family situation, and I'm just saying, so much easier to have these conversations before you have to have them. So I'm going to turn this back over to Andrea to kind of talk about some of those tools.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So we're going to talk about ways to prepare for the unforeseen. So some of the tools that we're going to talk about include things like transfers, wills, probate or affidavit, life insurance, funeral planning, or power of attorney. These are just some of the tools and considerations. All these can be done while you're still alive. And I want to note that this is just an overview. And if you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll try to answer them. But that doesn't mean that we will be able to answer them. Some of them you're going to have to talk to an attorney or a legal expert. And remember, since we have people from New York and Ohio or in Oklahoma, every state has different laws. And again, we're not lawyers, so we're kind of limited with what we know and can weigh in on sometimes. So transfers are a common way for an asset like a car or a bank account to be given to a designated person immediately after death. And these different terms that we're talking about are sometimes used interchangeably depending on where you are. So just keep that in mind. Organizations may differ in how they describe transfers within their processes or documentation. But essentially, they're all tools to transfer ownership of property or financial assets to someone else when you die. So for example, you can put a transfer on a car so that when you die, that person can immediately, with a death certificate and documentation, go and take care of transferring the car to their name, for instance. With payable on death, for instance, it's usually used with a bank account. You can name a person to have the funds if your bank account that's in your bank account after you die. And you may have picked this person maybe when you set up the account, and you might need to change or update it. Like maybe you set up your account 20 years ago and now you're married and you haven't even thought about making, if you have your assets separate, the transfer go to your spouse, or maybe you want it to go to your child because it's a fund money account, you know. But depending on the organization or where you're located, that could also be called a beneficiary at a bank. So just consider that as well. Transfer on death might be used more with houses, for instance, or cars or other assets that would need to be transferred. And beneficiary designations can also be used for retirement accounts or life insurance proceeds. There's a lot of other different places where you might see the word beneficiary designations instead of transfer. You can sometimes list primary and contingent beneficiaries to receive the funds or the asset after your death. And those designations are usually completed while you're signing up for or purchasing the insurance, for instance, or signing up for whatever retirement benefits you're looking at. So if you have any of those accounts, you might want to check and see who's your beneficiary or contingent beneficiary, and if they need to be updated. For instance, like maybe your aunt was the contingent beneficiary and she passed away. You wouldn't want to have her as a contingent beneficiary in case something happened to your primary beneficiary, for instance. So those are just some things to think about when it comes to transfers and how the terminology may differ a little bit depending on where you're at, what you're doing, and who's responsible for overseeing the transfer. So we like to use definitions sometimes. So a will, according to Merriam-Webster, is a legal declaration of a person's wishes regarding the disposal of his or her property or estate after death. This is especially refers to a written instrument legally executed by which a person makes disposition of his or her estate to take effect after death. So what do you think is usually in a will? So the easiest way to do it, there are going to be a lot of stuff in a will, but it includes your wishes, assets that you want to transfer, names of guardians for your minor children. There could be a whole bunch of other things that are included, like how you want your electronic assets, like your ETFs distributed, or who you want to care for your pets when you die, or how you want your social media handled when you pass away. So those are other things that can also be included in a will. In the state of Illinois, only self-proving or testamentary wills are legally valid. So a self-proving will or testamentary will allows for the will to be executed by going through the probate court without the need for witnesses to actually testify in court. So that is why you have to have two witnesses sign it in order to be valid. So they won't accept oral wills, they won't accept any audio or video recordings as legally valid wills in the state of Illinois. Every state is different though, and laws can change. So it's important to know what is legal in whatever state that you reside in. So something that we might talk about a little bit later when you're reassessing what needs to be in your will, If you move to another state, knowing what the laws are in the state that you reside would be really valuable in updating your will, for instance, when you make those big life transitions. So there are two ways basically to make a will. There's probably other ways, but the two main ways is typically you want to talk to an attorney that you can talk to them about what your wishes are. They can ask clarifying questions that you may not have thought about. And they usually store it for you. So that's really helpful. It can also make it a lot easier for your loved ones to know what to do when you die, since there's kind of a keeper of your will. This also might be more necessary for more complicated situations or estates. You could also use online tools or software. You can purchase software. There's free stuff as well. It can be easy to go this route, but not always, because like we've been talking about, every situation is different. And the more complex it is, the less likely the kind of default questions or features in the software or online will be able to accommodate what your needs are. They do range from kind of more simple to comprehensive. So if you're not sure where to start, maybe you're intimidated by just going to talk to an attorney, this could be a good place to get started for even just figuring out what you want when you do go talk to an attorney, right? And again, you got to make sure in Illinois that it is signed by at least 2 witnesses in order to be valid. So that's really important to note. So those are just 2 options. There's lots of routes you could go, but those are 2 good options to get started. All right, so we're going to use that chat again. Do you think a will is public or private knowledge? Yes, Kathy. So when you have your witnesses, you don't want them to be included in the will. It would be bad form for someone who's receiving half your assets to be the witness on the will. So find people, they're unbiased. You could even go to your bank and they could even notarize it, for instance, if they have a notary on staff. A lot of financial institutions do have notaries on staff, but you're unlikely to have your bankers be in your will, unless you're really close or you work at a bank, maybe. So what do you guys think that a will is public or private knowledge? Put what you think in the chat. I think it's private, probate is public, private. All right, so it's actually public knowledge. A will is considered public knowledge once you die. So Elvis Presley's will, you can actually look up. We put a copy of it, a link to it in the chat, so you can look that up. It won't be public knowledge until it goes through the court system and your assets are distributed, and then it becomes public. All right, so just to summarize, you can create a will electronically or with an attorney. You're required to have it signed by 2 or more witnesses in Illinois for it to be legally valid. The Illinois state law does not require it to be notarized, but it might not be a bad idea to get it notarized if you need an unbiased witness, right? Or 2 unbiased witnesses. Make sure that you tell everyone that it matters to where your will is located, where it is going to be stored. If they don't know where it is, they don't know how to implement your wishes. Even if you talk about your wishes, having things written down is really helpful because our memory is fallible, especially under stress or duress. So having a list can be really helpful. You also want to make sure to update it for life transitions. We talked about that earlier. So that maybe you're not in a situation where you've had 3 kids over 20 years, and because you didn't update your will for 15 years, your youngest doesn't even end up in your will when you die. And that can be a struggle if they're still a minor when you die, or distributing assets. It can cause strife or stress within the family. And it's just important that you have a plan and that you update that plan because our lives change. Since we have people from other states on and a lot of our students move out of Illinois, I think I mentioned this earlier, just updating your will when you move is a good way to make sure your will is valid in that new state, since, like I said, laws differ so much. All right, so what happens when someone dies when it comes to their property and their finances? This is called settling an estate. So the person dies. In order to settle the estate, this means that all of their property, including their cash, accounts, house, cars, boats, everything, etc., they're all collected. Any debts and any taxes that they owe are paid out of the value of that estate. And then whatever is left over is distributed based on a valid will or state law if a valid will does not exist. So that's kind of the process, general process. So there are legal obligations and procedures that must be followed when someone dies, no matter what path someone chooses. Like I said, debt's got to be paid, taxes got to be paid, all the property and assets have to be divided, either depending on how the person intended or how the law dictates, depending on if there was a valid will. And these different paths can be either the affidavit or probate. So with an affidavit, this isn't allowed in Illinois for estates without land and less than $100,000 in total assets. This document will summarize the estate and the distribution of the estate. It must be notarized, and it's usually coupled with a death certificate. And this kind of allows you to avoid having to go through the entire probate process. So the probate process is another option. There are two types of probate. There's limited supervision and full supervision. With limited supervision, that the judge reviews and approves the final accounting filed by whoever the estate administrator is. And then with full supervision, the judge administers the estate and takes a more active role in distribution of the estate. This is more rare. In both cases, things called letters of office are used to indicate a specific legal representative for the estate. So these are just a couple options that you might consider or might apply to you. Again, other places may have additional methods of settling a estate, especially if you're in a different state currently or will be in the future. So again, we're not attorneys, we're not lawyers, but this kind of gives you the terminology to be able to understand what's going on when it gets to that point. All right, one little did you know, in Illinois, cryptocurrency is actually recognized legally as an asset, so it could be included in an estate. And it's also important to recognize that some assets never make it into an estate. For instance, like if someone jointly owns a car or businesses, that might not be included in the estate. So those are things to also just know about, at least in Illinois, and other states might differ. So I am going to hand it back over to Kathy to talk about some of the planning and protection specifically for our loved ones.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And there's been some questions in the chat, which I've done my best with, but maybe you want to take a glance at while I'm talking and see if you have anything to add. I think we've already kind of said, like, under the why do we do this? Even though it's not very much fun, and it's often for our loved ones, we're trying to make it easier on them when we can't be there to be the ones to taking care of things. So next slide, please. One of the ways that we can do that is to consider whether or not we want to purchase life insurance. And essentially, life insurance's main goal is to pay out to a beneficiary, somebody that you've stated that gets the money when you die. And it's used typically to replace your income to support others. So for example, if I'm working and my income is supporting my children and I die and I can't work, then life insurance should help replace that. Maybe not 100%, but at least would help. There are two main kinds of life insurance that we just want to touch on today. One is called whole life and one is called term life. And I'm going to start by talking about term life and then we'll kind of add in. So term life is you buy it for a set amount of time. So it might be 10 years or 20 years. And you say, okay, I want this amount of money and I'm going to pay premiums like you do for car insurance or something, monthly, and sometimes you set them up to be paid on them like every 6 months or something. But anyway, you pay premiums. And if you die, then the insurance will pay out. And so sometimes people do, typically people, like I said, buy term insurance to support their beneficiaries or maybe to pay off a house loan, something like that. Okay. It does after those number of years that you signed up for it, you would typically terminate, and then you have a choice if you want to purchase more. And the prices can go up as you age. So it's more expensive to buy term life insurance when you're 60 than when you're 20 typically, which kind of makes sense because your odds of dying have gone up. So it's really pretty simple, term life. I think that's one of the things that I find very appealing to it is it's very simple. It's not very complex to figure out what it's doing. Whole life insurance it could be helpful to people in some specific situations. It is designed so that you don't have to renew it. You get it and you're going to keep paying it. You do end up starting by paying more when you're younger, and the premiums can stay the same during the life of the policy, but it can also go up, especially if you start it later. One of the things that it has is it has a savings component to it, a little bit of an investment component. And it's so that one of the things that people really don't like about insurance in general, I think, is that you can pay for it and never benefit from it. So just like with car insurance, right? You pay for car insurance. If you don't have an accident, you don't hurt your car, you're probably not going to get anything out of that. I kind of see that as a win, but it can be frustrating to people also. Same thing with term life. Until you die, you don't use it. With whole life, there is this other piece that may be building savings and investing for you, and that is reassuring to some people. However, there have been some studies that have looked at this, and in many situations, the piece that you're investing, the dollars you're putting towards that, you might have chosen a different investment if you'd used those same dollars that could have gotten you a higher return if you hadn't been putting them into the whole life. But as I said, there's two kinds. You have to kind of look at it for yourself to see what makes you the most comfortable and what makes the most sense to you at your place in your life, and think about that as you go forward. So I think I might have, from your perspective, why is purchasing life insurance important? Why do you do that? Or if you don't want to purchase life insurance, why? Because not everybody purchases life insurance and not everybody needs it. Any thoughts about that in the chat? I stumped y'all. I think peace of mind might be something that is one reason people do. Sometimes people want to cover certain things like burial costs. Dad bought it for me to pay taxes upon death, but no taxes anymore. Yeah, the inheritance laws have changed a lot. Protect my loved ones against financial risk. Good point, Jake. Purchased when we built the house and had kids. Yeah, you start seeing these obligations that you have and wondering, how will you pay for those, and life insurance can help. All right, thank you. All good points. So we have lots of different resources for you. If you want to look into insurance a little bit more, we have a webinar called Cover Your Assets. It talks all about different kinds of assets. We have a health insurance one called Dissecting Health Insurance as well. And then, of course, our Making Sense of Money podcast by IDF PR and U of I System is always a great resource for these topics too. And I think we got those links up in the chat. Thank you, Brooke. So while we're on the topic of death, let's talk a little bit about funeral planning. And, I think we all are aware that different people approach funerals in different ways, but until you kind of lay it out in a chart like this, I don't know that I had quite thought about all these different ways of, managing the person's body, essentially. And so these are good things to think about. They have different costs. They have different meanings for different people. People from different backgrounds may prefer one way or another, or different value systems. So I would, again, just remind everybody that there are these different ways to think about funeral planning, and you may want to give it a little thought yourself. And if you have strong opinions on this, again, it's very important to communicate this with family members or whoever's going to be having to manage this. And often this is not actually in a will. It could be in a letter attached to the will, but that's not, you will see wills for sure that don't have this information in them. And I think actually that's probably more typical than non-typical. So, at the same time, you can put this kind of information into a letter and have it be attached to the will, or give it to people ahead of time is always nice. So what types of funerals have you experienced? Have you seen things that are very traditional in your family, perhaps, or your family background, or things that are been a little different than you hadn't seen? While you're thinking about this, I'll just say that sometimes I'll tell a little story myself. Sometimes when you think you've got this all covered, when it happens, you realize that you didn't cover it all. So when my mother-in-law passed away, my husband and I knew that, and the whole family knew that she wanted to be cremated. Okay, so we thought that was simple. So we just said, yes, she wants to be cremated. There were still a whole lot of other questions that we had to answer related to that we had never talked to her about, like what to do with the ashes and how to manage that. And what kind of service did she want or not want? And so, in hindsight, when we were dealing with a lot of really sad emotions and upset emotions, it was very hard to make decisions at that point. And I wish that we had had more conversations and thought it through a little bit better ahead of time, and thought about what some of those questions. However, on the flip side, I will say I've asked my parents those questions, and they just say, whatever you want to do. So, sometimes you can start the conversation and it doesn't go anywhere, but at least you can try. Okay, so I'm not seeing a lot. We'll just keep going on this over to the fact that, cultural differences are definitely out there. We might really think about funerals as be kind of the way our family does it. But, colors associated with death can really differ. Maybe Black is very common, in your background as turning that what people would wear to a funeral. But in other places, we might see that blue or green are more common. Different things like jazz funerals, moving towards using burial beads in South Korea. Honestly, I have to look up more about those Ghana fantasy coffins. That sounds very interesting. I don't know about that.
They're amazing, Kathy.
Yeah.
There's a museum in Texas that actually has like 12 Ghana fantasy coffins, and they range from anything like corn to a Mercedes Benz, right?
Yeah.
It's basically the way that they view it is they want their family members to go out in style when they transition to the spirit world. So it's a really beautiful way to think about that transition. And sometimes, from what I've read, people will create coffins that represent kind of who they were or what they did in their lives. So that's why
Mhm.
you'll see different symbolism and representation depending on who the person was. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I think there's so many interesting ways to honor people's lives. And thank you, John, for sharing that in the chat. And again, pausing and thinking about how you want your life to be remembered or what you want to happen there. I think, again, you have that opportunity to think about that and to pass that on to others and let them know. So, and urine free funerals, I think, are kind of a sustainability piece that we're seeing more of. Putting it on a necklace, that's kind of like, what was that, where people used to use hair and make it into jewelry. So celebrating people's lives, lots of different traditions that make a difference in how, that brings closure to people, helps them have a chance to say something, and it matters, right? I think it does. All right, next slide is really about, now that we've kind of had a chance to share a little bit, thinking about what do you want and what would that look like? I think I would want my sons to play music at my funeral. That would be, actually, I want them to play music for me beforehand too, but like, that would be what I would really want when I sit here and think about it.
That makes so much sense with how much your boys care about music and how it's become a big part of your life now too.
Yeah, I think that would be fabulous.
Yeah.
All right, so all of this that we've been talking about is when somebody dies. But another really important piece of estate planning is, what about if you're not dead, but you can't communicate for yourself? And a lot of times we think about this when somebody is getting older and maybe their mental capacity is not as good, and somebody might step in and be appointed the power of attorney of property or finances, and be able to like pay for their bills and take care of their finances. But that's really only that is a piece of what power of attorneys of property can do, but it's just one piece. It can also come into play when somebody might be in the hospital or have a medical situation where they can't speak about what the decisions need to be made about their healthcare. And that's where we get into the power of attorney of healthcare. So they're two separate documents. You can have one and not the other, or you can have both. But basically, again, it is a way of putting in writing what you want done and when you want done. And it really can help you think through just even completing some of these things, like a power of attorney of healthcare with a living will maybe attached to it, is like, when do you want people to step in and intervene and when not? But essentially, a power of attorney gives somebody else the right to make decisions for you. And just to give an example, one time my husband had a kidney stone. It was that we needed to decide whether to have surgery or not. But he was in so much pain and so much medication for the pain, there was no way he could make that decision. Luckily, he had a power of attorney of healthcare with me being the person. And so I could make that decision. And it was very clear. We didn't have to make any, the doctor didn't have to worry about who was making the decision because we had that healthcare right. Power of attorney for healthcare right there. That was very clear that I had that right. You can make these and then revoke them. They don't have to always stay forever if you change your mind about something. But I do think that it is worthwhile to think about what are the characteristics of somebody that you might want for your power of attorney. So maybe we can throw that into the chat even. What do you think would be important for somebody who was your power of attorney for healthcare, for example? And it could be that the characteristics or the person could even be different for the power of attorney for property. They don't have to be the same person. So sometimes I know people will choose somebody in the family who is comfortable with medical situations, who maybe has medical background even, and, or as Karen says, not too emotionally attached for the healthcare. And that might be very important characteristics for the POA healthcare. For the power of attorney for property, it could be a different person. Maybe you want somebody who's just really good with finances, that is very trustworthy and honest, as LaTanya said. Those may be the characteristics that you're looking for. And so knowing what these are and thinking through them and getting them set up ahead of time is, again, I think, a very valuable tool to be aware of. Okay, thank you, people who are putting comments in there. We'll just keep going on. So we've kind of covered so many different things here already, and talking about when you're looking at your estate planning, it's more than, as I said, your assets. It's not just about wealth do you have that you want to transfer. It's who might take care of your children if you can, who might take care of your pets. What are you going to do about your social media? Other electronic assets that you might have. So there's lots of different pieces that matter. And if it seems a little overwhelming, pick one to start with. Start thinking about, getting your will in place, or getting a power of attorney for healthcare in place. Whatever you feel that you can get done, when then you get that one done, you can move on to others as well. And now I'm going to put this back to Andrea.
Thank you, Kathy. So I'm going to talk about how to start the conversation. We've talked about different terms, different things to consider, kind of wet your whistle on different things to think about when you're deciding what to communicate to your loved ones. So let's talk about how to have that conversation. So here are a few life stages, right? We have infancy, early childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, and later adulthood. This is very simplified kind of recognition of different life stages. And in American culture, we tend to focus a lot of our attention on infancy, early childhood, and adolescence a lot of the times. And that makes having conversations about later adulthood or end of life situations very challenging. We're not as comfortable talking about this particular life stage, so we don't always take the time to have the important conversations or set our plans up in case something is to happen, because like we said earlier, 100% of us die. We just don't know when. So even if we have thought about our end of life or wishes, and even tried to make plans, it doesn't matter if we haven't communicated with our loved ones about what our wishes are and where the documents are that they'll need to implement those wishes. So let's talk about some tips in order to get this party started, so to speak. So you can use maybe a story of a family member, maybe a loved one or a friend that had a death that wasn't so pleasant. Or you can use examples from celebrities. For instance, Aretha Franklin died without a will or a trust. We put a link into that story. Prince also had some issues as well when he died, and what happened to his estate afterwards. It ended up being distributed between his siblings. There were 6 of them. So it's good to have a plan, and everyone has different opinions about this topic. So your loved one might not be ready for this conversation on a specific day, and that's okay. So just generally, you might use someone else's story when you do start it. Consider writing things down. Write yourself a letter first to get it all kind of figured out. It's difficult to talk about without a plan. You might use popular culture references or websites to help you make a plan. We have a website we're going to talk about in a minute. You might practice your conversation with a friend. And remember, this is an ongoing conversation because your situation will change, your needs will change, your desires will probably change over time. So it's a series of conversations that may morph over time, and hopefully it is reciprocal, not just a one-way conversation, so that you can also understand what your loved ones want for their end of life wishes. So this conversation project is a free toolkit that you can use to help you kind of organize your thoughts around power of attorney or healthcare or what you want to happen when you die, and how to facilitate these types of conversations, whether you're just telling someone what your wishes are or you're trying to start estate planning collaboratively with a loved one or a partner. So that kit comes in lots of different languages even. So that's really helpful for maybe multilingual families. There are some scales to help you rate your own feelings in different difficult situations, because self-assessment, self-awareness is something that's really important for making all types of decisions. The last webinar we did, we talked about mindfulness. Practicing mindfulness before having a difficult conversation like this could be really helpful for kind of assess how you're feeling and acknowledging that before you go into this conversation as well. And this tool could be a way to get you started with kind of thinking about those things, and documenting what those thoughts are in writing, identifying maybe where your priorities are for conversations. And there's even a few ways, some examples on how to break the ice. So this is definitely not an easy conversation. We're to the point in the year where we might be able to see our family members for longer periods of time than we're used to. So it might be a good opportunity, if you're open to it, to start the discussion with your parents or your grandparents or your siblings about what it needs to look like. And like Kathy talked about earlier, this isn't just a conversation where older people are telling their younger loved ones what they want. This can also be college age students telling their parents or grandparents what they want. And that can really open it up to receiving information from older family members that may not be comfortable starting the conversation themselves. So that's also really valuable in thinking about approaching this very difficult topic of estate planning. All right, so just to summarize, estate planning is an important part of financial planning, but is only one part. It outlines your wishes in case of unforeseen circumstances, which I think we've already established are going to happen, like death is going to happen. But there are other things that could happen that could incapacitate you or make things difficult to make decisions on your own, and having a power of attorney for different parts of your life can really help facilitate things. So there are several tools that you can use. Like we said, power of attorney for healthcare or property that happens while you're still alive. It does stop when you die. Your property power of attorney does not continue after you die. The other tools we talked about was transfers and wills. There's lots of ways to do that. And it's really, really important to start discussing your wishes with your loved ones while you're in a sound state of mind in particular. So those are really, really important things to consider when you're thinking about estate planning. All right, so our next webinar is Steps to Investing on Wednesday, January 26th in 2022. It will again be at noon Central Standard Time. So feel free to join us. If you haven't signed up, you can register. Thank you, Brooke, for putting that in the chat. You can also check out other previous recordings for webinars on our YouTube channels. You can check that out as well at go.uillinois.edu/getsavvy, and you'll go to the Student Money Management Center YouTube page. And if you have questions, or if you put questions in the chat and we haven't got them yet, we will stick around, but feel free to hop off if you have somewhere else to be. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day today to talk about this difficult topic with us. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure your family will too.
Hi, Andrea. We have one question in the chat that I thought would be easier to answer out loud.
Okay.
And Donna had mentioned that, was it Donna? I'm sorry. Somebody said that we haven't talked about a living will, and that's true.
Oh,
We haven't
yeah.
specifically talked about a living will. A living will is a communication tool, again, that it lets you tell people under what situations would you like different medical interventions. So, how far, essentially, how far should somebody allow a doctor to go in terms of trying to keep you alive?
Okay,
And
yeah.
and one of the reasons I think we didn't quite mention it is much of that language is now incorporated into a lot of power of
Power of
attorneys for
attorney. Yeah.
healthcare.
Yeah.
So, there it is in that language, at least, like, for example, in my power of attorney for healthcare, the components of a living will are built into it. And so it's in there. But that sometimes when somebody it doesn't want to, for some reason or other, have a power of attorney for healthcare, they might, though, be comfortable with a living will that helps them communicate those wishes that way. And so that is an option as well.
Yeah. And I don't know about the living wills explicitly, but I've read the power of attorney documents for healthcare for Missouri and for Illinois. And I can see where, even though it's incorporated, like in the Missouri one, it's kind of difficult to understand unless you know legalese, like if you're a lawyer. So I can understand how maybe having a document, a living will that's more plain language would be helpful.
Sure.
So that's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. I don't know about the process to go about implementing a living will, and if there would be, I think that's something you'd have to talk to a lawyer about. I don't know.
I mean, for example, a piece of a living will sometimes is a do not resuscitate, a DNR.
Yeah.
And those are very common for if you go in for a medical procedure for a hospital to ask you to either sign or not sign, or, make a decision about, which is another great example of a time when you don't want to be trying to think through this. And it's nice to have already done it. So, I think that's, another piece that you might think about that. And I'm trying to see if I can find us a link here on a living will. Let's see if there's any other questions while I work on this.
Well, while you're looking at, I'll share a story. So my grandpa lived with us when I was a teenager, and he had a lot of health issues. He also had a do not resuscitate order, and it was plastered on his wall in his room. Just to make like we knew where it was in case anything happened. And I guess that was helpful for us to know where it was, for sure.
Yeah, and I've had people talk about, where do you put these kinds of things? And sometimes people talk about on their refrigerator so people can find them. And I always thought, that actually kind of makes sense.
It does.
So again, a lot of these things, we are trying to provide you with the information to then feel comfortable going and asking questions to a lawyer. And I think that is really important. In my personal experience, I've found that when I have gone to talk to a lawyer, that they bring up things that are very important to me that I do want to consider, but I hadn't thought about it. And I would have missed that if I had done it a different way. So I think those are really, it's great to do your pre-work, learn about it, think about it, and then decide what's the best way for you to get these documents in order. And it may very well be that a lawyer is one of the best bets for you. And somebody was saying that things do change, and that is for sure. I've been teaching on this for a while, and things definitely change, as well as links, which is always really annoying. But so, staying up to date on those. And we've really only covered a few of the power of attorneys. There are some other power of attorneys available in different situations. So if somebody in your family has mental health problems, that's another type of document. These may be things that are useful to you in some situations, but we only had a few minutes, so we have to focus.
Power of attorney can be limited to very, very specific things. Like one of our colleagues previously mentioned that she used a power of attorney for someone to go sign her mortgage paperwork because she was at work. Like,
Yes.
and that's literally all that they did.
Yep,
So
and that's the way it would be written. It would be just for that one transaction.
yeah.
So,
And the dates can terminate as well. So there's a lot of different utility for power of attorney in different situations, but hopefully we gave you some tools to use, not just for managing your family's estate or your estate when you die, but also even just like living your life, right? So you don't have
absolutely.
to commute across country to sell a house, for instance, or to another country if you're living outside the country.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions. And if we missed something, please put it out there again.
So thank you everyone for joining us and being active in the chat. That always helps give us some feedback and it helps us learn from each other. We all have different experiences and stories to tell. And this is a difficult topic to talk about. So it's good to have different perspectives and we appreciate that.
Have a great day, everybody.